me just a second. I just want to make sure that it shows up. There we go. We got it. There we go. We got it. Awesome. And basically, we're back for more fishing adventures. I believe I have 50-ish black bass to catch. 54 to catch. Hello. I'm just gonna be watching basically Kitchen Nightmares.
Too much olive oil everywhere. You think there's too much olive oil in there? It's like a heart attack way down. I hope there's Arsenal nearby. The chicken. Absolutely dreadful. I just need to taste the chicken. Just taste that. It's dry. You sound like a politician now. Okay. I'm not fucking around. It's gross. Do me a favour. Can you ask your brother to taste that? I want you to try this. What's the next dish? Paella? Then the paella. The paella.
Oh no.
What did Michael say? He's trying it right now with the paella. What do you have to say?
I thought it was fucking good.
No problem, man.
Have faith on me, baby. This ain't a normal guy. It's a Brit, huh? The pain in the neck.
He thought it was fucking good. If he thought that was fucking good, then I'm screwed. You're screwed, imagine how I am.
So we have the French onion soup to start you off.
Thank you, darling. Who made the soup?
Joe makes the soup.
Joe, wow. Thank you. The cheese is barely melted. Large, packed with onions. There's so much fat on top of it. Greasy.
This is going to GR. Amy's up.
Oh, what is that?
Oysters Rockefeller.
Okay, great. Thanks, darling. Yeah, greasy on top.
Okay, I'll let
Greasy
him know.
poultry and short cheese with onions.
Okay.
What happened here?
That is a parsley infused oil
And he squirts that on top.
around the rim.
Jesus. Right.
I'll check on you in a moment.
Thanks, darling. Wow.
Joe, Chef Ramsay said that it was greasy, had a lack of onions, and not enough cheese.
Not enough cheese? Let me go talk to this guy. Chef, would you like us to prepare another French onion?
Joe, it takes about 4 hours to caramelize the onions. I'd like to move on.
Want to move? Okay, sure.
I'd like to continue tasting
Sure.
it.
Okay, let's do that then. Have you had an opportunity to taste the Oysters Rockefeller?
What's this? Is that a bechamel on top? What is that on there? What do you put there?
It's the hollandaise.
Hollandaise, because it's all broken, but I had to spit that out because it's bitter. That normally comes when oysters are frozen. What's the oil around the outside that's like...
We just put a little bit of our olive oil. It was just more of a garnish. They should not have been.
Can you see my rib?
But I don't see anything on the oysters.
Well, I got it in there, there.
Well, we're not dousing the plate in oil.
I'm not here to argue. I'm just telling you.
Yeah, I can make you another one of these if you want to just keep on moving.
Oh, no. Let's move. Let's keep
moving. I got you. Okay, I'll take these away.
Excellent.
When it comes to Chef Ramsay, I'm not intimidated because I know a lot of chefs. I've cooked, been all around. Oyster Rockefellers was terrible. That's funny, man.
Oh, look. Please, put that down. That looks... Oh, what's up a rack?
This is just so we can show our...
Who makes the cake?
They come from Cleveland.
Looks like a procession of fuel and cake. Off we go and throw some flowers at it.
Okay.
Ready? This is what you do when people are dead.
Do you want me to sing too? That's all the rest of the cake.
Come on. Right, you got it from here. Here we go.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
While the owners continue to blame each other for the restaurant's problems, Chef Ramsay is anxious to taste the food.
So this is our combination appetizer.
Okay. What's all that oil on there?
We usually drizzle the top of our appetizers with olive oil.
Or flood?
Usually we drizzle, but it looks like there's a little extra put on.
Yeah, I'll say. Could I have a teaspoon, please, darling?
Of course.
Wow. Drizzle sparingly with a touch of oil, but look at it. I've got little spoonfuls, miniature bathtubs full of oil floating on the side. It's gross.
Come on, catfish. There we go. Another one?
Very carefully. Just start staring at me. Because he just stands there and stares. Put a little dish first. Put this oil.
Oh, yeah. Hey, we're going to stop staring at him and creep him out. A little dish.
Put it with the oil.
I'm not quite sure it wasn't back there.
Wow. This is awesome. Oh my god. So then, yes, it's liquid. Is that normal, that running that? But also,
I've been told it depends on the hormones of beans.
really? We're going to start blaming him for him being hummus?
There's times where the hummus will be extremely thin, and there's times where the hummus will be overly thick.
Yeah, but it's not beans for. It's the chefs.
I feel like I'm always apologizing for the food.
No, I don't. I'm done with that.
Okay, but I'm not a chef. It's out of my control. Who put the oil on top of the appetizer?
I did it.
I said it's a lot of oil.
It's tradition to put a good amount of oil on hummus, so for Chef Ramsay not to like it is a shocker to me.
It's a disgusting busing station and it's dreadful. There has to be a much better place for dirty dishes than that. That's bad. Now, it's weird how you just drop all those dirties there.
Yeah. That's where it should go.
Why not just all 5 feet and put the dirty plates inside the plate wash?
I don't know.
How difficult would it be to go straight into the kitchen?
Not hard at all. Chef Ramsay is right. Like every time I try to open my mouth, every time I have a suggestion, I basically get told to shut up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And you put the Z on. What's the Z? Rosina? Kind of a design. Looks like someone's puked up on my plate. Oh, come on. Does that look appetizing to you? Yeah. Doesn't look too appetizing. It doesn't look appetizing at all, no. Okay. Thank you. No problem. That looks like the inside of a diaper. I mean, it's so bad. Jeez. The bottom makes it look like someone's been on.
Oh, God. Now let me enjoy your meal.
Man. I'm done there, man. That one mouthful was too much.
I'll get that out of your way.
Thank you, by the way.
You're welcome.
One thing I can confirm, it tasted the way it looked. Dreadful.
Nope. I'm not a winner. Okay, whatever.
What is that, olive oil?
Yeah, but it doesn't taste
Yeah,
like
no,
olive
it's
oil.
much my little taste. It's very watery. Tastes like frying oil. Excuse me, sir. Is Tina nearby?
Yeah, absolutely.
Please, thank you. Well, that's dreadful.
Tina, Chef Ramsay's asking for you at 43. Tina's been such a hands-off manager for so many years now that she's become so blasé.
Yes, sir.
What is that olive oil there? Is that canola oil?
No, it's
What? Palm oil. Is that what you're serving there?
that mix.
Look at that. Jeez, it smells off. You smell it? What's in there?
I don't know.
When was the last time they were cleaned?
I don't know.
The front of the house? What a mess. It's the bathroom nearby.
Yes, sir.
Wash my hands.
To the right.
Shit, what happened there? What's that?
Tiramisu.
Oh my god. And they're done every day.
Probably a couple weeks ago.
Wait, that a fake tiramisu? Like, that's a real tiramisu? Oh, come on. So that's just sat there, from fresh. And you said 2 weeks?
No, probably 3 weeks ago.
That is longer than 3 weeks. This stinks. I'm sorry. Oh my God. Sam,
Yes.
how long have these desserts been sat here?
A couple months.
A couple of
Couple months?
A couple of months, just over 3 weeks.
No, I would say under a month. It was a couple months.
Do they stay out all night?
Yeah.
That is a fucking health hazard. Oh my God. Shit, my boots.
I can't do this.
The chef's delirious.
Here's some stuff away.
This is the stuff for today.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome.
Wow. What a mess. I asked for mid-rare, but it's the wrong. It's almost like you're going to stick your knife in it to kill it. I mean, the thing's still fucking moving. Sam, I'm trying to cut into that. I asked for mid-rare, but it's like
It's
raw.
little raw.
Is that steak frozen?
Probably.
Did you just check with the chef?
Yes.
Was that steak frozen? He wants to know.
I don't. Was this frozen?
Yeah.
Yeah. That
Okay,
one
well, he
was.
said it's raw.
I don't know if I should laugh or cry. Which one?
Almost crumbs under there. Why is everything so dirty here? There's crap everywhere. I mean, just crumbs and hairs. Disgusting. Tina, how often is the restaurant cleaned? I know you've got the dates wrong with the dehydrated desserts.
We do our own cleaning.
You do go and clean it. I appreciate that. That's not why I asked. How often is the restaurant cleaned?
How often? I can't answer.
You can't answer. Okay. Who knows the answer to how often the restaurant's cleaned if it's not you?
I should know that.
You should know. There.
I think I already saw this one.
Chef Ramsay is going to love this food. It's simple food, it's basic food, it's feel-good food, but it's done very well and fresh.
Okay.
Boiled shrimp.
Thanks, honey.
Yeah, no, I've seen this one.
Louisiana shrimp. Yeah, everything's soft. They should peel.
I love bread. There, I said it. I admit it. I love bread. And that is why it pains me that medieval manuscripts rarely talk about bread. It's probably because they were written by cooks for cooks rather than bakers, but I wish that we had actual contemporary bread recipes from the time. But the Harleian manuscript 279 does have one. Now it's a 15th century recipe for something called brede and reston, or bread and rastons. I don't know how to pronounce it, probably reston, you know, it still have a lot of French influence, plus I think it sounds fancy. Anyway, today I'm going to teach you how to make your own reston at home and let you decide that age-old question which has broken up many a family. Is a reston bread or is it pastry? This time on Tasting History. Now, I put the original 15th century recipe in the description below, but it's kind of in a Middle English dialect, so good luck with that. You can actually get most of it, which is kind of cool. But I'm also going to give you some of the highlights right now in modern English. Take fair flour and the white of egg and a little yolk, then take warm barm and put these together until the dough is crumbly. Cast sugar into it and let it rest a while. Then place it in an oven and let it bake. Then cut the top crust in the shape of a crown, put clarified butter inside, and stir the crumbs and butter together. Cover it with the crust you cut away and put it in the oven again. Then take it out and serve it forth. So as far as medieval recipes go, this is pretty darn good. You know, it doesn't have exact measurements or bake times or anything like that, but they never do. But in essence, it gives you everything you need to know, so good job, medieval scribe. Sure. But here's the question. With all of that sugar and butter and egg, is this a pastry or is it bread? Now, the term pastry was not something really used in the Middle Ages to refer to pastry as we think of it today. Pastry simply referred to the shell of a pie or tart, and that was it. But by today's standards, some people would actually call this a pastry. So, I mean, I honestly don't know. And until I taste it, I'm not going to really be able to make an informed opinion. But if you have a strong opinion either way, please let me know in the comments, either now or whenever you make it at home. But I digress. Let's get to the ingredients. First, fair flour. We're going to use 450 grams. Now, fair flour is not the same as processed, bleached, all-white, all-purpose flour that we have today, but it's actually not that far off in comparison with some of the other flours that were used at the time. It's finely ground, well-sifted wheat flour, and it's basically the closest thing that you're going to get to modern all-purpose flour, but really, it's not the same. So I'm actually using about half all-purpose flour mixed with half stone-ground whole wheat flour, and, you know, that's what it's going to be. But if you have all-purpose flour, if you can find flour at this point in quarantine, whatever you got, it's good to use. And we're going to come back to flour later when we put on our history hats. I don't know what that looks like. Is it a crown, or maybe that, like, Mickey Sorcerer's hat? I need a history hat. Next, it calls for white of egg and a little yolk. So we're going to use 2 egg whites and 1 yolk. I'm actually going to use that second yolk, since we have it, and I hate wasting things, to brush on the top of the loaves at the very end before we pop them in the oven, just to give it some kind of dark sheen, make them pretty. But that is a Max Miller edition, so don't feel that you need to do it. Then we get to the tricky part. It calls for warm barm. Now, if you make your own beer at home, or if you have access to a brewery that is willing to sell it to you, good on you, use about a cup of warm ale barm. But if you don't, we're going to make our own, or something akin to it here. So what you're going to need is a cup of warm ale, English ale, whatever you got, and a packet or about 7 or 8 grams of dried yeast. So you want that ale to be above room temperature, maybe like 90 to 100 degrees, and you're going to take that yeast and pour it on in and mix it up. Then let it sit for about 10 minutes to get nice and foamy. Finally, we need a little bit of sugar. Now, it said cast some sugar on it. How much sugar is it? I don't know. We're going to use 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. You can use a little bit more, you can use a little bit less, totally up to you. Then 1 stick or 113 grams of butter. Now, the recipe does not call for salt, but they often would leave things like that out of old recipes, and salt is just a common thing in bread, so I'm actually going to throw a teaspoon of salt in there as well. You can, you cannot, it's up to you. Nobody's looking. Now, after about 10 minutes, your faux barm or ale yeast concoction should be nice and foamy, at which point you can go ahead and mix it with the 2 egg whites and 1 yolk. Then toss in the sugar and mix that in. It doesn't need to dissolve, just kind of break it up. Then sift your flour into a bowl and whisk in the salt if you're going to use it. You want to mix it in because if it touches the yeast directly, bad things happen. Now, the original recipe says this dough should be short or crumbly, like short bread. That's where the term comes from, which is a hallmark of a pastry. But it also needs to rise like bread, meaning like you need to really work the gluten and be able to get a bit of a stretch in it, which is a hallmark of bread. So here we are again, no further along in our quest. So mix all the ingredients up together in the bowl, and as it kind of comes together to form a crumbly dough, you're going to put it out onto a lightly floured surface and knead it. Now, you can use a stand mixer, but this is actually a pretty easy one to knead by hand. So if you've ever wanted to knead a dough by hand, this is your time. Once it's nice and smooth, after about 10 minutes of hand kneading or 4 or 5 minutes in a mixer, you're going to cover it and let it rise for about an hour or until it doubles in size. Now, while that rises, let's take a look at that main ingredient, the fair flour. You might remember if you watched the Trencher episode, I'll put a link up on one of these sides. The Trencher episode, we talked about lots of different flours that were used in medieval Europe, mainly medieval England. Oat and barley and rye and even flour made of dried peas. These were the flours of the masses. But we are wealthy. Not really. But today we're wealthy. So we are going to enjoy fair flour, which is wheat flour. Wheat, the loveliest corn men eat. That was 13th century moralist and didactic poet William de Waddington. What he's referring to is what corn should be used to make communion wafers, because you want them to be made out of the best. Well, that's going to be white refined wheat flour. And by corn, I mean any grain, because until relatively recently, like 200 years ago, corn basically referred to grain in general. So dear to Waddington's observation about wheat being the proper corn for communion wafers also extended to other breads. And, you know, wheat was the corn of the upper crust. It could be refined into a pale white powder that was very high in gluten, which gave bread a wonderful rise, which is probably why Scarface was so in love with it. Anyway, it was prized, but the men that made it, the millers, my stock, they were not always the most liked people in town, and frankly it was dangerous to make. So let's take a look at what made bringing flour to the people so dark.
I figured the new sunroom would be great for my plans, but I had no idea it would help hard.
Let us start with Geoffrey Chaucer. It's a very good place.
20 more.
Mr. Chaucer does not depict millers in the best of light. Now, each individual character in the Canterbury Tales is individual, but they also kind of represent the zeitgeist of medieval society. And, like I said, millers, not loved. The miller in the Canterbury Tales is a man who tells dirty stories, starts fights, and breaks through doors with his head. He has a wart on the end of his nose, bristled with red hair like the kind that grows out of a pig's ear. This is not exactly a glowing Tinder profile. But where Chaucer reflects the true feelings most people had about millers in the Middle Ages is when he says, in modern English, a thief he was, it's true, of corn and meal, and sly at that, accustomed well to steal. He also mentions the miller as having a thumb of gold, which is probably an ironic comment on the old adage, an honest miller hath a golden thumb, meaning that they usually had a heavy thumb when it came to weighing their product. I.e., my ancestors were thieves, I guess. Go figure. And if you think it's just Chaucer ragging on my relatives, you would be wrong. Because around the same time, John Lydgate, in his ballad Thievish Millers and Bakers, suggests that millers and bakers should build their guilds right beneath the pillory, because that's where they usually end up anyway. Makes for a short trip, I guess. He even says that if they're repeat offenders, they should be killed. Wow. And did I mention that Lydgate was a monk at Bury St. Edmunds? So if you don't even have monks on your side, yeesh. Though I think my favorite little tidbit about Brother Lydgate was actually an 18th century poet commenting on his works. Joseph Ritson said that Lydgate was a voluminous, prosaic, and driveling monk. That hurts. But not as much as losing a hand. And a lot of millers lost hands. That's right, not only were millers not appreciated, but they also had to work in conditions that were less than OSHA approved. Last summer I visited the Winchester City Mill. It's the oldest working water mill in England, and something has been on that spot making flour since the 10th century. And while I was there, I was privileged enough to watch them actually feed some corn or grain into a chute that went down to the millstones where it was ground into flour. Of course, now they have lots of protective equipment around these millstones, but back in the Middle Ages, there wasn't anything there. So these two millstones that can weigh between a ton and a ton and a half and rotate against each other at up to 120 RPM, they were just out in the open. So if you accidentally got a hand or even some clothing caught between these millstones, you were screwed. Even worse was the series of cogs and wheels all around the building that turned these millstones. I mean, they were just open and such a disaster waiting to happen. But let's say that you were lucky enough to be safe at all times and not lose an appendage, and you made some wonderful fine flour. So fine that the dust of it puffed up into the air, creating a bit of a cloud. Well, don't light a candle, because you might explode. That's right, probably the most dangerous part about being a miller throughout history, not just the Middle Ages, but throughout history, has been the fact that they're grinding carbohydrates, which is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, extremely flammable things, into a fine powder all around them. And they would sometimes touch a spark or a flame and blow up. And like I said, this is throughout all history. This is not just the Middle Ages. On the evening of May 2nd, 1878, the Washburn A Mill in Minneapolis, then the largest mill in the world, exploded, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air, killing 14 workers. Turns out that two of the millstones, grinding against each other, got hot and let off a spark, which ignited the flour, which created a chain reaction. There goes the whole building. But you're saying, that's the 19th century. Things are very different. No. I mean, yes, I'm sure it's a lot safer now, but it's something that still can occur. I found several examples from the 1980s. It's not easy being a miller. But frankly, in the Middle Ages, it wasn't really easy being anyone unless you were the king. Because the king got to eat restaurant, which is what we're about to do. So, it's good to be the king.
Hello, beautiful. Room-changing pieces, game-changing prices. HomeSense, this changes everything.
So once your dough is risen, punch it down and turn it out onto a lightly floured surface. Then you can divide it up into whatever size loaf you want. I'm going to make 3 separate loaves, but you could do 6 and they'd be like little rolls, or you can do one big loaf, totally up to you. The bake times are going to be about the same. But regardless of how many loaves you make, the recipe says that you're going to cut the top into the shape of a crown, so I assume that means round. So make round loaves. So shape the loaves and then set them onto a lined baking sheet and cover loosely and let them rest for 20 to 30 minutes while you turn on that oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius. After about 20 minutes, the loaf should be nice and puffy, and here is where, if you want, you can use that optional egg yolk and give it a nice beat. Add a little bit of water if it's too thick, like mine was, and then brush the tops of the loaves, and they'll be nice and shiny and dark. Then with either a knife or a bread lawn like I have, they work amazing. Score the tops of the loaves however you like. Then pop them in the oven for between 25 and 30 minutes. If you're making one large loaf, 30 to 35 minutes, but if you're making like 6 little loaves, then check them about 20 minutes in. Might not be done, but good to check. You'll know when they're done when they sound hollow when you tap them, or if you have an instant read thermometer like I love, then just look for that 190 to 200 degree Fahrenheit read, and that is when they are ready. So take the loaves out of the oven and let them cool on a wire rack. Now you don't want them to cool necessarily completely, but you're going to be using your hands to pull out the inside, so you don't want them too hot. So now what we have here is a lovely little loaf of bread, perfect for, one person or so, but it's not a restaurant. To get a restaurant, it takes a song. You cut your restaurant, then you got your restaurant. Mix the butter and crumbs in the butter restaurant. Put the crown on and let it bake 5 more minutes. There, now you have your restaurant. But seriously, all you have to do is cut the top of the bread off in the shape of a crown or whatever is easiest, and pull out the insides. Then you're going to crumble them up into a bowl and pour melted butter over them. Then mix them together and restuff the loaf with them. You might not be able to get all the crumbs back in. It's a little bit like Tetris, but you can push them down. It's fine. Then put the top back on and pop it in the oven for 5 minutes. Now, if the loaf is already darkened quite a bit on top, you're going to want to tent it with some aluminum foil when you put it back in, just so it doesn't get too dark. After 5 minutes, you can do as the recipe says and serve it forth. So here we are, a restaurant, fresh out of the oven. Let's give it a shot. I don't exactly know how to eat this. I don't know if you just pull out the insides or if it's too big to bite into, which I guess wouldn't be the case if it was smaller, but I'm going to just try the insides because that's where the buttery goodness is. Let's go. So buttery. I mean, okay, first of all, not a pastry. Meh, yet. This is bread, and it's really good bread. Very flavorful. I think it's a good thing to use a little bit of the whole wheat flour, just to kind of zhuzh it up a little bit, but really good. I wish that I had a steak to go with this, because this would be really good, like, alongside a steak, because it's not a meal in and of itself. It's a little bit of work, but it's worth it. It's worth it. And it's kind of cool. I like the So like I said, the original recipe as well as the modernized version are in the description down below, as well as some links to the tools that I used and some of the ingredients as well. Anyway, make sure to hit that like button, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Yeah, I need a steak. Which steakhouses were open? Now, we've all heard the phrase to eat like a king, but today I've decided to up the stakes and feast like a pope on torta d'erbe comuni, or common herb pie. Bartolomeo Scapi, personal chef to the papacy and pioneer of Italian Renaissance cuisine, leaves us this recipe which is so rich that I might have to sell some indulgences just to pay for it. This time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from Bartolomeo Scapi's seminal work, the Opera dell'arte del cucinare of 1570. Per fare torta d'erbe comuni, to prepare common herb pie. And it's the herbs that are common, not the pie. Get tender shard greens, spinach tops, mint and marjoram, cut them up small, wash them, and let them drain by themselves. Then get 2 pounds of fresh ricotta, 1.5 pounds of grated Parmesan cheese, 6 ounces of fat cheese, 6 ounces of fresh butter, 1/2 ounce of pepper, 3/4 ounce of cinnamon, 1/4 ounce of cloves, 6 fresh eggs beaten, and 6 ounces of sugar. With all those things, make up a filling. Have a torte pan ready, lined with a sheet of royal dough and with its flaky pastry twist around it. Put the filling into it and cover it with a rippled sheet of pastry. Bake it in an oven or braise it. Serve it hot. It is optional whether you make it deep or shallow. I love that he calls this a common herb torte. It makes it sound so light and healthy. And then you read what's actually in it and put your cardiologist on standby. Despite the cavalcade of coronary clogging, it's the perfect autumnal dish. I mean, why procrastinate on that winter body? But despite that, it is going to be huge if we use the amounts that Scapi prescribes. So I'm going to half everything, and it's still going to make a massive pie. So, for this recipe, you will need chard, spinach, mint, and marjoram. Now, the amount of those greens that you use in the pie is really up to you, but I would steer away from using too much mint and too much marjoram because they will definitely overpower the chard and the spinach. 1 pound or 450 grams of ricotta cheese, 3/4 pound or 340 grams of grated Parmesan, 3 ounces or 85 grams of a high-fat cheese. Now, he doesn't specify what fat cheese to use, he just says a fat cheese. So I ended up using mascarpone because it was becoming popular around that time in Italy, and it's a little sweet, and you'll see Bartolomeo Scapi loves sweet things in his food, so that's what I'm using, but go ahead and use whatever you like. 6 tablespoons or 85 grams of softened butter, 1 tablespoon of pepper, 4.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of cloves, 1/2 cup of sugar. Now you're probably thinking that I said the wrong amount of some of those spices. I mean, 4.5 teaspoons of cinnamon and a tablespoon of pepper, that's a lot. That's a lot of both of those things, and you are right. We'll get into it, but Scapi uses a lot of spices and a lot of sugar. 3 medium eggs, and 2 portions of flaky pastry dough. Now, when it comes to the dough, you can pretty much use whatever you want. He says royal dough, but he's not terribly specific in the book of exactly what that is. There are multiple versions throughout, but it is going to be like a flaky pastry, so just make any kind of flaky pastry. Now, he also mentions a flaky pastry twist. That was a really complex leavened pastry that was made with butter, eggs, and rose water, and then it was sprinkled with clove and cinnamon and sugar and nutmeg, and then it was rolled with either hard-boiled egg yolks or bone marrow, and then pine nuts and raisins. So really, really complex, really, really interesting, and something that we're not going to be making today because it was only added as decoration, and then it was actually removed and eaten completely separately. So it's not really part of the dish. It's just there to kind of bake along with the pie. But I would love to someday do an entire episode just making it because it sounds really weird. So first we are going to blind bake the bottom crust of our torte. And that is because it does tend to get a soggy bottom if you don't. And if you don't roll the dough thin enough, like I did not, it also tends to get a little bit of a soggy bottom. So make sure to roll it nice and thin. So go ahead and preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 Celsius. Then line either a deep pie tin or a cake pan with half of your dough, prick the dough with a fork, and then fill it with pie weight. I can't find my pie weight, so I ended up using rice. It works great, but you can use beans or whatever you want. Once the oven is heated, set the crust on the lower rack of the oven and bake for about 12 to 15 minutes or until it's fairly dried out. Then take it out and let it cool completely. Also, go ahead and lower the oven temperature to 350 Fahrenheit or 180 Celsius, which is what we will bake our torte at. Then wash and dry your greens and chop them up nice and fine. Then in a large bowl,
make sure you stock up
the ricotta, the Parmesan, which Scapi calls the greatest of the cheeses, the mascarpone or whatever fat cheese you're using, and mix them all together until fairly smooth. Then add in the eggs and beat until incorporated. Then add in the butter and the sugar and mix together, and your spices and mix those in as well. Finally, add in your greens and mix until evenly distributed. Everything mixed together using an electric mixer, but once you add the greens, mix that part by hand, otherwise the greens will get all beat up. Then pour the filling into the crust and smooth the top. Then place the other half of your dough on top. Now Scapi says it should be rippled, which I thought was really weird because when I put my dough on and rippled it, it just kind of looked odd. But then I realized it's because the insides are going to expand a little bit, and this will allow for the dough to expand with it. So then at the end, the dough is pretty much flat, kind of magical. Now you can put the torte in the oven right now, but if you want to give the top a little bit of color while you're in there, go ahead and put an egg wash on top. Then set the torte in the oven on the lowest rack for 1 hour, or until the top is nice and golden. Now while our torte bakes, I am going to subscribe to a glass of wine and ask that you subscribe to Tasting History, and make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss your weekly dose of food history. Also, that reminds me, let us look at what else Signore Scapi's opera prescribes when feeding a pope.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
Pope Pius V.
So I'm just going to
1566, and
adjust this a little closer that way.
To reform the Vatican from what he saw as overindulgent. Kind of looks like a sneaky Santa Claus in that image. One of his first actions was a papal bull prohibiting bullfighting, an anti-bull bull. But that was followed by a number of less endearing decrees, such as the banishment of Jews from most of the papal states in 1569. But in his fervor to reform the church, he also did away with many of the lavish state dinners that had become so popular under his predecessors. So that left Bartolomeo Scapi, well, not out of a job, but with a lot more time on his hands. So just like I have that YA fantasy novel kicking around in my head, and one day I'm going to put it down on paper and ship it off to a publisher, Scapi had 1,000 recipes in his head, which he finally had time to put down for us in a book. So in 1570, Scapi published the Opera dell'arte del cucinare, more often referred to as Scapi's opera, and that means Scapi's work. It doesn't actually mean like an opera like we talk about it today. There is no singing, unfortunately, in this book. The opera is actually broken up into 6 books, the first being an imagined conversation with his apprentice Giovanni, kind of telling him how best to run a kitchen. And what's really interesting is you get a glimpse into the mindset of a chef of the Italian Renaissance. He must be alert, patient, and modest in everything he does, and as sober as possible, because whoever is without a good deal of sobriety loses patience as well as a natural taste of things, though I find a glass of wine in the kitchen actually aids in patience. He should place his patron's honor along with his own above all else, and his usefulness to his patron above everything else. First and foremost, he should endeavor to understand the nature and quality of the princes and other lords whom he will serve, so as to he should not rely upon nor have complete faith in his assistant nor any other subordinate, keeping in mind the old saying that he who places great trust will end up greatly deceived. Good advice, I suppose. Not just a little cynical for my taste, but Scapi's lack of trust in his subordinates is illustrated by something actually in the kitchen, which he mentions later in Book 1. On one side of the room should be a cabinet 10 hands high and 6 wide, with several compartments that can all be locked, holding sugars, spices, and other things used daily in the personal food of the prince. Now the cabinets needed to be able to be locked because the spices were incredibly precious at the time. So he didn't want, people wandering in and stealing his spices. Also, Scoppy loved his spices. Basically, he kind of set the tone for Renaissance cuisine being just filled with spice and sugar. Sugar was his favorite. Out of the 1,000 recipes in the opera, fully 900 of them have sugar as an ingredient. So while we see recipes for dishes that are reminiscent of something that we would eat today, like an early form of pizza or lobster or even chicken soup, the amount of sugar and spices in them would definitely give your palate a bit of a whirl. And so he deals with those recipes over the next 5 books. And in the second book, he talks about quadrupeds and fowl, and has one of the first recipes in Europe for turkey. Though while Scoppy calls it turkey, he also says that many people are still calling it the Indian peacock. It's kind of a cool name. Now, just like the turkey, there are other birds and meats that he mentions that you would find on a modern-day menu, like a roast duck with black grape sauce. It sounds really good. But then there are also some animals that you might have trouble getting down at the market, like hedgehog piglet, or porcupine, or bear. There are also recipes for every part of a cow imaginable, from parboiled calf's eyes with fennel and cinnamon to a sweet sugared bull testicle. So, if you're still wondering what to hand out for Halloween this year, Book 3, he discusses the nature and season of fish. And fish and seafood were a vital component of the Vatican diet because much of the year were considered lean days where you couldn't have any meat. And I cover this in depth during the episode where I touch on Lenten foods from the Middle Ages, so go ahead and watch that if you're wondering how a beaver is actually a fish. Now, Book 4 takes a lot of the recipes from the previous 2 books and puts them into menus. And he basically goes through the entire year, month by month, creating menus for both meat and lean days. He also talks about different implements in the kitchen and goes into a wonderful description of an actual event, a conclave of cardinals, which we will discuss later. The 5th book, where we get our herb tort recipe from today, deals with all sorts of pastries, including many savory pastries that include a lot of sugar, of course, but then some things that are definitely like a modern-day dessert, like a cream pie, and even a precursor to a modern pumpkin pie. Now, the last book is really a collection of soup and broth recipes because it was meant for the convalescing and the sick. And while you'll see things like cauliflower soup or barley gruel, there's also a recipe for ferrous potion. Ferrous meaning iron. And so you're thinking, oh, well, someone must have like liver or beans or some other iron-rich food. You'd be wrong. Nay. The recipe calls for pieces of steel heated in the fire, which you will dip into water. If you do not have any steel, get a worn-down iron horseshoe and heat it up instead. Let the water sit for 3 hours, then filter through 3 layers of a white cloth. I mean, I guess that's not really that different from modern-day iron pills, but horseshoe? An old worn horseshoe is that? I kind of feel like it's possible. So those are the 6 books of Scoppy's opera, but there's also an appendix, which was printed separately, almost as an afterthought, but is actually the reason that the opera is seen as such an important work today, because what it is a bunch of pictures. And it's really the first cookbook to have a lot of pictures, so we get to see into what a Renaissance kitchen actually looked like. In the first room of the kitchen, we see a massive hearth with a cauldron suspended above it, a little man sitting beside it shielding his face from the flame. In the next room, there are sinks with running water and cooks rolling out pasta dough on a huge table. There's also a Hippocratic sleeve in the center of the room, which I talk about in the episode on hypocrites, though this one is probably used for making jelly or butter. In the scullery, which here is an outside courtyard, a man is washing pans, and another behind him sharpens knives on a wheel, with water spouting from a barrel above. Then we have a cold room where they're churning butter and mixing custard. Now sometimes if the Pope had to travel, he brought the kitchen with him, and Scoppy shows what a field kitchen would look like, along with a depiction of how the huge cauldrons made it on and off the fires. Now most of the remaining images are of various kitchen implements, including one page devoted almost entirely to knives. though Scotti also includes the first printed image of a porcina, or fork, which had only recently become popular in Europe. He includes images of cauldrons and pots for cooking and serving, including several which he deems tortere, one of which might have been used to cook the torte that we're making today. But the most famous image in the book is actually not of the kitchens, but of the food being delivered for a meal, and an actual meal. It's based off of a real event that I mentioned earlier, the papal conclave, where cardinals would gather together to elect a new pope. This one began on November 29, 1549, following the death of Pope Paul III. Stewards bring in hampers filled with hot and cold foods, which were then given to church officials to be inspected for secret messages to the cardinals that might sway their vote. Once inspected, the dishes would be placed on the ruota del conclave, or wheel of the conclave, which would spin and deliver the food into the Sistine Chapel on the other side of the wall. For over 2 months, this is how the cardinals got their food, until on February 8th, Julius III was elected pope. Now, while we don't know everything that was served every day at the conclave, it's a pretty good bet that our herb torte made its way around that conclave wheel at least once in those 2 months. So while you may not have your own conclave wheel at home, mine is being installed next week, you can go ahead and give yourself a little spin as you take that torte out of the oven. So once you take the torte out of the oven, set it on a wire rack to cool just a bit, but it should be served hot, so don't let it cool more than 10 minutes or so. And here we are, our torta d'erbe comuni, or common herb pie. So it smells really great, and it looks fine, though it kind of looks like ground beef. Which is odd, you know, I mean, it's not a vegan meal, but it is a vegetarian meal, so maybe it's like a mock ground beef pie, because it really looks like ground beef, the color and everything, which I don't get. I thought it would be more green, but it's almost brown, and I think that's probably because of the vast quantity of cinnamon and pepper in there, but let's give it a try, rigor.
Sorry, guys. I knew I was tired, so I wouldn't be able to play along, but I did not think it would go this fast.
Oh, that's weird. Oh, it's good, but oh, that's so weird. Those herbs are coming through.
Okay, have a good night.
Along with the cheese and everything.